Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ethics Experts. So glad that you joined us today. And if you are a subscriber, hey, welcome to the show. It's great to have you. And that's what's going to happen every time you subscribe to the Ethics Experts. You get an extra special intro at the beginning of each show. So let's get into it. I am excited and proud to introduce everybody. If you don't know him already, Alexander Hall from Dispute Defense Consulting. Alexander, welcome to the show, man.
Hi, thank you for having me. This is very exciting.
Yeah, glad you're here. Why don't you give us a little bit of an intro to what you do at Dispute Defense, and then I'd love to just start off by having a little chat about your career and how you came to be in the role that you are as, an advisor for, risk and fraud.
Awesome. Yeah. So the breakdown is I've got 14 years of experience between fraud and fraud prevention. It's split into two parts. For the first decade of it, I was operating as a high-level fraudster in Las Vegas. And when my baby came into the world, I changed my tune, turned myself in on certain charges, and started fighting for the good guys. And
Cool.
So that started in 2017. Did a lot of good work there. And then in 2020 in March, whenever everything happened, my position was dissolved where I was. And that's when I started Dispute Defense. What I had identified during my time in e-commerce fraud prevention was that there's a lot of good service providers out there, but there's also a lot of unknowns that are there's a lot of questions that are still out there regarding fraud. So what I've put together to be unique in the space is Dispute Defense, and what we focus on is strategy development for companies. I don't want to say merchants specifically because I'm able to service a pretty wide net, right? I cast a wide net. So so starting in March, I started Dispute Defense, and so far I've been working with merchants, service providers, a lot of different industries in order to help them understand where their risks are by pulling on my experience from the past.
Cool.
And help them develop strategies that are going to last them the lifetime of their operation. And then also one thing I'm proud to announce is last month, now that we're in September, last month I was invited and accepted the role of a board advisor to the board for UNLV here in Las Vegas. So
cool.
That's my latest accomplishment.
That's great, man. Well, congratulations on the new post to the board. I'm sure that'll be cool to have that impact there and have that inside track. But it's such a cool story. It's honorable, I think, for you to turn yourself in and say, hey, you know what, this is the right way to do it. And I think it's cool that you've made something, you've made a positive impact and, kind of can start helping companies kind of see around the corner and prevent this stuff. So good on you for that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and there's a lot of stuff to make up for. So there's a lot of work to do.
Cool. Well, let's keep working on the right side. So talk to me a little bit. Let's just do kind of lay of the land. You work not exclusively, but you do a lot of work with financial institutions and merchants who are doing processing. Talk to me about what kind of the scope of things that companies like that are concerned about when it comes to fraud. And if you like, kind of dig in on like the specific areas where you help them kind of figure out how to prevent those.
Sure. So I would say, so after attending MRC this last week, it was a real eye-opener because I got to interact with a truckload of service providers and merchants at the same time. So we were all put together in the conference. And one topic that was really heavily directed, it was a real heavy presence, I should say, is the balance between establishing a customer experience while mitigating risk, right? And so those are two opposing sides, right? They're like polar opposites, because when you think about merchant security, it's normally to the detriment of a customer experience, customer satisfaction. Typically, those are like the two fighting sides. So
talk a little bit about that. Like, what is the conflict there, or like what are some examples of that trade-off?
Sure. So reducing friction is the term that's thrown around a lot. And so the concept is, if I want to protect my company, I need to verify everything across the customer journey, right? So when that happens, I get a lot of dissatisfied customers. They don't want to check out through a 20-page process. They don't want to be turned away due to false declines or false positives and things like that. So it's a big concern for merchants across the board when they're putting friction into their system. But at some point, it's necessary to add friction because the reality is your customer experience is also the fraudster's experience.
Yeah.
Right. So if you have no friction at all, yes, all the good customers are coming, but the fraudsters are going to have a heyday. They're just going to go to town.
Okay.
So that's why it's such a big deal to address these things. And that's why, in my opinion, that's why it's so important to have an effective strategy in place, because you'll know what you need for your risk assessment. And then you also can strike and maintain that balance for customer satisfaction for your customer journey. Yeah,
that's great. Yeah. So sorry, I paused you on that, but it's a great dynamic to be obvious and upfront about, because there's that, that friction is present in really all of risk management, right? There are a lot of people in our audience that, are across industries and different parts of the organization, but so much of the time when we look at, well, we need to do this thing, we need to get this survey filled or this assessment filled, or we need this policy to be 20 pages or whatever. If you're just looking at the risk management and not realizing the friction that it causes, you can get kind of upside down, not just on a it's harder to do than it should be, but also it can kind of get in the way of you visualizing and addressing risk because, people don't participate or something. So sorry,
right.
That I want to let you get back to, you were saying, that was a topic that was at this conference, but you were kind of going on to kind of give us the landscape.
Yeah, and I mean, and so that's pretty much the biggest concept that's in play from the merchant perspective today. Everyone wants to establish a customer experience journey. And it's our job in fraud prevention to make sure that they understand the risks that are associated with it. And so really what it boils down to is, so the second part to that is to understand that due to the crisis of 2020, just all around, and all the indirect effects of the events of 2020, there's a lot of otherwise good-hearted consumers who are getting desperate, who have lost jobs, who have lost income. And so now it's an interesting dynamic in the world, because no longer is it simply fraudsters taking advantage of merchants. There's also good-hearted consumers, otherwise good-hearted consumers, who are aware of these exploits and maybe vulnerabilities like chargeback abuse, or some people call it friendly fraud, which I think is a bad term for it. I call it chargeback abuse, sure. Right? So it's a good consumer who, in desperation, makes a purchase and charges it back, saying that they didn't receive it, and it's a dishonest chargeback. So in my opinion, it's called chargeback abuse, right?
Okay.
So now
it's a little clearer. There's not a lot that's friendly about that.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's another dynamic that's really come out over the last 12 to 18 months is you're no longer a merchant simply fighting against fraudsters. They're also fighting against dishonest consumers in their own category, right? Yeah, and so there's a lot to talk about, but I just think the emergence of these new methods really make it difficult, especially when the customer experience is the primary focus for so many, right?
Yeah. I mean, that customer experience is the path to growth, and the way that you can be innovative, and the way you can, roll out new products, or, get new customers or whatever. It's so important, but obviously, especially in finance, you're always doing this kind of actuarial balance of like, well, how much friction do I put into this, right? It's a conscious decision of, right, like, do I have 20 pages or 8 pages or 2 pages on my checkout process or whatever, or right. How long, how much are we going to check this credit card before we put it through, or whatever that might be. But you kind of have to subsume all of those things in some equation that gives consideration to what that customer experience is, which I think makes it super important to have someone like you at Dispute Defense coming in and saying, hey, you obviously can't go full bore, right? You can't wait 45 minutes to approve this transaction, right? You have to be balanced. And I think that companies increasingly need it, and are also realizing that they need the advice to say, okay, well, what is material here? What matters, and what should I be doing so that I can move past kind of setting my friction level and then focus on that customer experience?
Yes, 100%. Use your baseline for protection, and then from there, adjust to strike and maintain the balance between the two. 100%. Yeah.
Cool. So You made an interesting comment when we were chatting before this, which I'd like to dig into. You said that identity information is the basis for all risk management. So I think that that's a powerful statement. I think that there's a lot in that, and I think it's a really interesting lens to bring into the discussion of understanding where identity is at the core of a bunch of this risk management. Because I think depending on what someone's background is, they might see it more as a process or more as a, kind of behavioral decision or something like that. Talk to me about how central identity is.
So I wrote an article for a publication called Card Not Present, wherein I discussed my outlook for the method development that I used to employ when I was on the bad side of things, right?
Okay.
And so what I brought to the table was that every single fraudulent method, whether you're establishing lines of credit, whether you're hijacking ATOs, like account takeovers for financial institutions, whether you're using checks for payment, it's payment fraud. Every single method has really three components, right? So you have the identity information, and that's going to be who is the person over here enacting the engagement, the interaction. So if you're establishing in a bank account, if you're trying to enact payment, if you're trying to get something delivered, the billing address, the social security number, your IP address, your device ID, all of these data points that pertain to who is making this engagement or this interaction falls into the category of identity information. Cool, great. Then you have payment information, pretty simple. It's going to be your credit card number, expiration, CVV, whatever. And then the third one is system knowledge. By knowing what the institution needs or verifies, you're able to create these methods, or fraudsters are able to create these methods. Now, when you talk about payment information, although it's important to know that the information is accurate and can be processed for the payment or whatever it may be, you're really limited in those data points, right? It's only going to be the information of the payment, right?
Right.
When you go
There's not like a substitute for the credit card number. You can't say, I'm going to give you my address instead.
Right, exactly. Yeah. It's only those 5 or 6 data points. Maybe you can expand it out to like 7 or 8 if you have historical data and consortium data. But when you get over to identity information, you can leverage identity information in order to make determinations for every interaction that a company has, right? So if someone's opening a new account, are they submitting information that's been associated with the social security number successfully over the past X amount of time? The IP address, has it been geolocated to be related to the billing address and the shipping address that's been seen before and is a trustworthy thing? The name, the phone number, and the list goes on. And the bigger your consortium data is, or the bigger your merchant network is, or the more historical data you have, the more accurate of a determination you can make, which in the end goal is to make accurate determinations, not just protect the company and not just give away the cow. So that's why I feel it's super important to focus on the value that identity information has over simply looking for accurate information. Verify over just accuracy, like with payment information.
Yeah. That's a really interesting dynamic. And, I don't know a lot about this, but the way that you lay it out, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like that payment information. And I think there are analogs for other types of fraud, right? But there's something that is restricted that is kind of the base of the exchange, right? And then there's something before that, the identity information that, you can come at it a bunch of different ways, right? Like, how do you verify that a painting is authentic? Or how do you verify that, wine came from where it was, or that this order came from this company? It can be a bunch of different things, and you end up triangulating around all of this. And, I think it gets back to that friction point, right? Like if it can only be these two things and you have to have both or something, that can be a hard thing. But if you can authenticate a few different ways, you have less friction in that, right? Someone can log, you don't always have to be at your home IP address. You can log in somewhere else and have MFA to kind of get in there. You can have a wider and more flexible customer experience, but as that flexes, you have more opportunities to either manage risk or to manage it poorly, because that identity information can be so squishy. Am I getting that right?
100%. Yeah, identity information is not easily, but it is manipulatable. Like it can be manipulated by fraudsters, whereas the payment information can't. So there's a trade-off for sure, but with as many data points as can be looked at for identity information, it's a much more in my opinion. It's much more reliable to focus on changes to identity information to rely on an accurate determination than it is to just ask for accurate payment information.
Yeah. So I really appreciate you bringing that up. I like that frame. Can we touch on that third piece? You said that third piece is system knowledge, and I imagine if someone's intentionally trying to commit fraud, that's, you kind of need to have all three of these, right? You can't kind of, it's hard to kind of miss that. I imagine that system knowledge is kind of like if you're good at picking locks, you know where the tumblers are, and you can kind of pick a few of these different locks because, I got to kind of hit these things right. But talk to me about, that system knowledge and how, maybe how that facilitates or enables fraud, but, maybe more importantly, how people bring the potential for system knowledge into their risk management.
Sure. So, actually, that's the next narrative point that I plan to really touch on in my own content. So it's great that we're expanding on it here. That's cool.
Let's workshop it.
So the thought is that when you talk about the perpetual nature of fraud, right? So if you think about 10, 20 years ago or 10, 20 years into the future, fraud will be around. Mm-hmm. It just matters to who's being affected by it. So if you look at it from a merchant perspective or a company perspective, it's their job in their own capacity to make sure that we don't get hit by fraud, right? Okay. But if you zoom out from a 10,000 foot overview, you tend to realize that there's a full spectrum ranging from protected companies all the way down to very, very vulnerable companies.
Okay.
And when a fraudster is operating, there becomes this trend and these silos that they tend to fit different merchants and different companies into. For example, restaurants are highly susceptible to fraud, just generally speaking. Okay. Almost as a rule of thumb for fraudsters, restaurants are easy. In addition to that, hotels, casinos are pretty high vulnerability. They have low friction, and they're very susceptible to fraud.
Okay.
You move to the other end of the spectrum and you start thinking about financial institutions. You start thinking about things like that. A customer expects friction when they're dealing with a bank, right? And they have no problem leveraging that. And that's okay because they need to verify some stuff. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. If you're doing a $200,000 wire transfer, you're probably gonna have to sign some documents.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So the important thing regarding the perpetual nature and system knowledge is knowing fraudsters to know what they're trying to attack, what to expect, and what's the basic rule of thumb there. And so as you go through the whole spectrum of merchants, and cross-reference that against the spectrum of standardized protections, you expect more protection at a bank than you do at a restaurant, right? So yeah, and that's really the overarching story for it. Fraudsters interact with companies in order to build what I call checklists, and that pretty much outlines what you need to accomplish in order to get over on these various companies.
Okay.
So for companies, for banks, it's important to know where your vulnerabilities are, which again is where I step in to help you see them, bring attention to them, and put checks in place.
Okay. So it seems like you're saying if someone's trying to commit fraud somewhere at a financial institution or at a restaurant, they're going to do kind of an audit up front and say, all right, what does it take to kind of get this through here? Here are the steps in the process. It needs to get approved by the branch manager, whatever it might be. They're going to be kind of making that checklist, and you and your team at Dispute Defense can go in and say, hey, here's how someone's going to kind of build their plan of attack here, and they're going to be checking these things, and then you can maybe take them through that checklist and say, all right, well, this one should be, verified a different way, or, this is somewhere where, you have some vulnerability, and you can maybe step that up, and you can get this trade-off, right, where you're getting significantly more risk protection without significantly more friction in the customer journey.
Sure. That's a perfect way to articulate it.
All right. Nailed it. So I want to get your perspective on this thing that I'm not sure if this is new or going on, or maybe this is old hat, but from what I understand, the approach to verifying transactions or maybe authorizing identities has been fluctuating in the past, I don't know, maybe 5 or 10 years. And I think of kind of how Stripe was kind of able to, authorize people as merchants with an algorithm that was different from the traditional kind of apply to a merchant, service clearinghouse and stuff like that. And I think that, Uber does some of that stuff with their drivers and things like that. As that continues to progress, right, we're kind of moving this frontier of let me make it easier, but still maybe hold the line on my risk management and removing that friction. How is that changing the game for, specifically risk management? Is it just that much easier because we have such greater algorithms, or are there some kind of countervailing forces there that we're just dealing with a lot more complexity?
So, okay, yeah, that is very interesting. Okay, so I work with a lot of different service providers all across the globe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or, several, I should say. I don't want to say a lot because there's hundreds of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and the thing that's been really interesting to learn since coming over to this side of the fence is the fact that there's a lot of information,
okay.
B, a lot of collaboration,
mm-hmm.
And C, there's as of 2020, there's a lot of resources being thrown at this.
Okay.
So, in addition to just algorithms and weighted formulas and weighted algorithms and all that for these determinations, there's also a lot of data behind it. Okay, so it's important to talk about the structure of data. There's typically 3 divisions of data coming from a service provider.
Okay.
One's going to be proprietary, which is probably going to apply to the fintech due to all the regulations, and for the financial institutions and stuff like that, it's going to be proprietary information. So by searching one company's information, they can make determinations based on historical data. Cool.
Okay.
2 is going to be a merchant network. So if a service provider has, Target, Walmart, and Best Buy, they have a fair share or they have a fair amount, right, of historical data to reference. But it only is accessible to the service provider, and then it probably responds in like a risk assessment score based on that data.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's consortium data, where it's going to be a collaboration of public information across the board. How has the information pertaining to this data point being seen across the globe? Okay. How has it resulted? Is it a good transaction? Blah, 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 blah. Mm-hmm. So those are the 3 things: proprietary, merchant network, and then consortium data. Okay. With that's the first step, is developing the data. The second one is establishing weighted algorithms. So you're going to have weighted algorithms based on the risk assessment with the data points that are coming in at the point of transaction. And it's all automated through an API, or some people choose to only use it as part of an escalation process, where they'll manually put in the information then trigger it. So, so there's that. Mm-hmm. And then the third one, the third point is just the overall collaboration between all of the service providers, not just in a data sense, but mm-hmm. also in operation. Everyone reports on what they found. Everyone reports on what they're seeing, puts out these white pages, these webinars, and there's a big collaboration. So to your point, when you see the end result of automation, it's the end result of a lot going on in the back, and there's a lot of collaboration. And coming here from the other side of the fence, I have to say, I'm extremely impressed with what these people have achieved without knowing what's been going on. Like they're making tremendous headway. It's been really good.
And what do you mean by without knowing what's going on? You mean they're not as educated in what fraudsters are trying to do? They're just, kind of maybe reacting to transactions that clear and don't clear without knowing kind of the process that's coming at them from the other side, something like that?
That's the premise. Now there's exceptions. There's people who go into the dark web and do their research and kind of act like counter spies and all that, counterintelligence. But generally speaking, these amazing software providers and these amazing service providers just see a chargeback and start to connect the dots in the dark, and until someone like Frank Abagnale or Brett Johnson or I step in and say, hey, that's an example of what's going on here. Let me shed some light on that. They're operating in the dark, and for them to be doing that and achieve what they achieve is just really phenomenal.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. They're just kind of seeing it come out one side of it and reading patterns there and figuring it out without knowing kind of how those balls are being thrown or something. But you can discover a lot when you what do you say? A lot of data, a lot of focus, and a lot of resources being thrown at this, and a lot of collaboration. So I appreciate you bringing that up. You spoke about something earlier that I think is more broadly relevant than I noticed when you brought it up, but you talked about these, I love the term, the friendly fraudsters, that there's this mix of, there's some people who just intentionally set out, do a bunch of homework, and are trying to commit fraud. And then there's some people who kind of stumble into it and they're a little tempted, or they're in a tight spot or whatever. And, in some senses, from a distance, a company might say, like, if you're ripping me off, you're all criminals and stuff like that. But I think from a risk management standpoint, it suffices to take a little bit of a different understanding, if not a different approach, to those different archetypes, because there may be different ways to prevent, and exclude those people, and maybe also different ways to kind of read those types of interactions. Because I imagine, someone doing, chargeback fraud is not as sophisticated and doesn't know all like the systems behind it and stuff like that, like someone who's committing kind of large scale fraud is. But I think there's an analog to what a lot of people in the risk management space experience. And let's just kind of talk about a company broadly, right? Like, you have some people who they're sociopaths and they got a job there just to rip the company off, and they are trying actively to harass everyone they can, or constantly forging their expense reports and stuff like that. So that's some proportion of people. And then there's kind of this next layer of a bunch of people who do some stuff wrong and they didn't realize it, or they kind of slip up and they get used to it. And that's probably a much bigger percentage by headcount. We can talk about where like the net risk is. But I think a lot of times we deal with this dynamic where it's easy as a risk prevention or a risk management professional or an ethics expert to just kind of draw this distinction and say that the people on the other side of the line, they're all the opposite of me. They're all really bad, and they probably hate their kids, and they probably curse at their mom, and they're probably, stealing from the dish at church or whatever. But they're really, kind of some of these shades of gray of some people of like, yes, we want to manage that risk. We don't want those people doing that. We can talk about whether we would put those people in jail if we found them, but they're not as maybe nefarious or pre-planned and things like that. And I think there's a lot for us to learn as ethics experts, especially as we're trying to push the frontier forward of what risk we're actually managing, of not just, finding the sociopathic murderers in the workplace, but finding all of this slippage of people of, hey, you know what? Maybe if we manage that a little bit differently, maybe if we kept a little tighter eye on it, we could keep, these 1,000 people of doing things 2% wrong instead of these 5 people doing things 100% wrong. What do you think about that?
Oh yeah, definitely. To compartmentalize what you're approaching is necessary, because it's also important to understand that when you automate any of these systems, when you develop these artificial intelligence or machine learning, I don't want to use the term rules because they're fluid and dynamic, and rules kind of sets it in place like it's carved in stone.
Right.
But when you establish these processes that automate the process, when you establish them, you got to know what you're focusing on. And there's going to be different call signs for each and every one of them. For example, the chargeback abusers, the dishonest consumer, they're actually using their credit card. They're putting through a real good transaction. Right. There's going to be a different determination or a different call sign, I guess, to what would indicate that, right? So in all reality, the first time a good customer decides to do the chargeback abuse route, they're going to get away with it, because there's no prior indication that that's a bad transaction.
Right.
They've been good this whole time. So the first time, for sure, it's likely going to work. But thankfully, like you were saying, that doesn't represent the vast majority of what's going on in the world. So that's why it's important for that specific avenue for people to go into these consortium data and kind of collaborate. Because if someone employs chargeback abuse at Walmart, well, when they go to Target to do it, it's going to be in the historical data. When they go to Best Buy to do it, it'll be in the historical data.
I see.
So every method requires a different attention and different weighted, algorithms based on what's been going on relevant to that identity information.
Yeah. Yeah, and I see what you're saying. Kind of that first signal is hard to pick up on, right? Like, if someone charges back, Walmart purchases on their MasterCard 15 different transactions in a month, like, you're going to get that flag. But if they're doing it across a bunch of different cards, across time, across retailers, that's going to be harder to pick it up. But if you're involved in one of those consortiums and you're looking for that, and you have screens kind of trying to, bring up yellow, orange, and red flags for that, then you can start kind of unveiling that a little bit. Cool.
exactly.
So, uh, another thing I'd like to dig in on a little bit is you talked about how the way that you approach managing risk is kind of changing maybe over time or maybe just changing depending on what your perspective is based on who's getting affected by it. And I think that's a really interesting perspective to look at this because a lot of us, we sit at our desk and we're working on this project for this company or this perspective. And the risk and, the negative outcome can be born in a bunch of different places, right? Like, is it born by the retailer or the merchant processor or the credit card or insurance or whatever? And that, in some ways that's good if, fraud is committed as, I'm a consumer, fraud's committed on my card because someone steals my card. I don't have to pay for it. That's great. But that adds some complexity to this risk management process because I imagine as you get through those layers, you maybe have less of that proprietary data or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And depending on what the industry is that you're working in, you're going to be using different systems, right? So an e-commerce merchant is going to have a different set of systems in place than an insurance company. They might both use payment processing online.
Yeah.
But it's a whole different process. There's no fulfillment on insurance, and
right.
I mean, until you need to until you get into an accident on that extent, but there's
right.
no product being shipped, right? So then you talk about the restaurant industry. Well, that's a really high turnover thing. When you have a transaction, you got to go in there, you get the food, you leave, and if you get a chargeback in 2 days or 30 days, the product's long gone. There's a short time to respond. Yeah, so it's different based on what industry you're in, how you service your customers, and then there's the B2B. Then there's drop shipping that has the indirect, the service provider versus the retailer merchant, dynamic, right, where the fulfillment comes from somewhere else, but the processing of the transaction happens with the drop shipper. So all of that changes, and then you got to consider every single exploit that might happen along the fulfillment chain. So you got social engineering with the customer service line, you've got the chargeback abuse on the back, you've got returns, you've got refunds, you've got loyalty points, you've got promotion abuse. None of these things are transactional in that there's payment information when the exploit happens.
Okay.
So you got to be able to put in all these different checkpoints along the way.
Yeah.
And there's a huge potential of creating a lot of friction for good customers, which is why, again, it's so important to strike that balance and maintain it while being pretty dynamic as things evolve. Yeah.
Yeah. So plenty of work for people to get your help with that dispute defense, huh, Alexander?
I like to think so.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's really interesting to kind of lay that out, all those different times and sequences and interactions where fraud could occur, right? It's not just at the purchase point. Depending on the industry, the purchase point is disintermediated from delivery, or there's no delivery, or also, it's after I buy it, or after it's shipped, or after I return it, or something like that. And all, I imagine all of those points add complexity to both vulnerabilities that fraudsters can exploit, and also things that we as risk managers need to keep an eye on, huh?
Absolutely. One thing that I always say is, I in my work, I've stopped saying transactions exclusively as the word to watch for, because you're not just watching for transactions. A term that I'm trying to coin, I guess, is the term transfers of value.
Okay.
Every engagement where a company is exchanging something with a person is a potential place where fraudsters are going to try to exploit. If there's a valuable transfer, if there's a transfer of value, a fraudster is going to want to get that, and the typical fraudster is going to hit it and then hit it 100 times, and then get 10 of his buddies to hit it 10 more, 100 more times.
Yeah.
And so when the sharks smell blood, they come in. So
yeah, before someone gets wise to it, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Which is actually the next point. Fraudsters can dip and dive immediately. When I was operating, I was able to put through 20, 30, 40, 50 transactions in a day, and with different merchants, and do the testing and in order to author these methods and build those the checklists. Fraudsters do that. Fraudsters can be nimble and dynamic and fluid, flexible.
Yeah.
Merchants and companies can't. They got R&D. They got development of the process. They got to talk to their software developers. They got to get the resources to dedicate. They got to go through management. So the response time for a fraudster might be seconds to change their approach, whereas a merchant or a company or financial institution, they need to go through months or years of development in order to respond to this trend that's been identified.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I get how a fraudster could move quickly and say, okay, well, I'm going to a different spot, or I'm going to use a different pitch, or I'm going to social engineer this a different way. For the company to react to that, they got to, figure it out, develop software, roll it out, test it, train people on it, all of that stuff, which
Right.
I think just, explains the dynamic of the amount of money and effort and data and resources that are put behind risk management, because you need to, as much as you can, be kind of ahead of that curve or ready for it when it comes, huh?
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So want to give you a chance to kind of wrap up with any final thoughts, including maybe give us a sense, Alexander, what you think is really exciting that's coming up, or, where you think that, if we had this conversation in a year, what would we be talking about, hey, here's what has kind of gone from an idea or a murmuring into kind of, close to front and center.
That's a big question, especially after wrapping up MRC. There's so many great things going on.
You don't have to pick one,
I think that, okay, so let's do the 10,000 foot overview. So I think that with the effects and the indirect effects that came from everything that happened in 2020, COVID and the indirect stuff from it, the employment of BOPIS, buy online, pick up in store, the curbside pickup, so many in-store retailers and in-store locations moving to e-commerce. It's an unfortunate thing, but I think what it did was it sped up. Okay, so when all of it took place, what ended up happening was a lot of merchants moved into e-commerce or adopted these practices: the buy online, pick up in store, contactless, curbside, all this stuff, telephone, blah 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 blah, right? And when they did that, they started to experience a dramatic spike in fraud just across the board, right? Yeah. I mean, you've probably heard about the travel industries just going to hell because of all the canceled things, and then all the ATOs that have been happening in that industry, and just all the crazy stuff that's been going on. So unfortunately, it happened, but fortunately, it happened because now there's so many eyes on fraud. Whereas before, fraud prevention and risk assessment and threat analysis and all this stuff has been coined as being sales prevention. Well, now merchants and companies are realizing, I need to be protected. Look at what's happening in the entire landscape. So it's an unfortunate thing that this huge spike happened, but it's good because now there's coverage of it. Now people are aware of the significance of it and the kind of impact it can have on their companies. So to answer your question, what I'm looking forward to is companies now understanding that proactive prevention outweighs responsive action 10 times out of 10. You can put in $50,000 today into a new software, and it will save you $1 million worth of transactions. When I first took fraud prevention, when I first got my first fraud prevention job, right, as an analyst, in 6 months, I mitigated and prevented $1.2 million worth of losses spread against 4 or 5 different methods that I was aware of.
Wow. That's cool.
This company, thank you.
Good job,
This company, had they taken preventative measures, would have never seen those losses to be mitigated in the first place.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that the devastating effects of 2020 lead to fraud prevention being taken seriously. And I hope that merchants and fintech, blah, 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 blah. I hope everybody understands that we understand the value of the balance between customer experience and merchant security. Cool. That's my hope.
That's great. I appreciate you, wrapping up with something hopeful, because there is a lot of room for progress here, right? I think a lot of that, companies staying out of e-commerce or staying out of, buy online, pick up in store, stuff like that. It was some mix of, well, that's going to be hard, or we don't feel like we have to do it, or, there's a bunch of risks that we don't know how to manage. Well, a bunch of people got kind of thrown into the deep end. A bunch of companies got thrown into the deep end last year, and that's unfortunate to kind of, get caught off guard by that. But also, to your point, on the bright side, well, now you're in it, and now you have to find a solution to it, and now you're getting more dynamic and figuring it out. And I like that idea that you bring forward, that proactive prevention is going to beat reactive response all day long. And I think it's something that around, the broader, governance, risk, and compliance industry, around the, the broader ethics professionals that are in our audience, and really kind of everything that's going into this broader ESG movement, is around this idea that you're not going to be able to put a dollar value on the future risks prevented 4 years from now, right? You can't say, well, I know that the risk is going to grow like this over the next 4 years, so look at the sum of all those years and let's put 50 grand into it now. You're not going to be able to do that. But if you, and ideally, if you can lead your board and your executives into this mind space of it's coming. I don't know if it's preventing 1.2 million or 4 million or 800,000 of fraud over the next 3 years, but it's worth spending 100 grand on doing this now. If we can get into that mindset, then we can start leading our teams and our risk management departments and our programs forward into this space where we don't have to wait for the building to burn down to start doing fire prevention. We don't have to wait for someone to say, all right, well, I guess we got ripped off for $1 million this year. Let's kind of start cleaning that up. It's going to take leadership from people like you, Alexander. It's going to take leadership from people in this ethics and this risk management space to say, hey, here's what we're heading toward. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's big enough to take this step. And I think that, we should all be hopeful about that yes, that's a harder conversation to lead than like, look what you lost last quarter, let's do it. But that's what our companies and the people at our organizations and consumers require of us as leaders in this space, to step up and say, this is the right thing to do now. Let's invest into it. We can be nimble and we can leg into it or whatever, but let's do the prevention now rather than reacting. And I think that, we continue to see, we've seen it over the past year and the past 5 years, companies that do that end up getting these positive externalities of they were ready for it. They weren't caught off guard by this. They could kind of swim through this channel because their boat was ready for those waves, and they end up making progress faster. They end up having those lower friction, consumer journeys, and they end up growing better, innovating better, and being more successful because they did that prevention up front.
Absolutely. Yeah. And to add on to that, no matter what, you're going to have something at some time,
right?
No matter what. And it's not going to be perfect straight out the box. So get it and then develop it to fit your needs as your company expands. It's actually our strategy development process is 4 steps. And I'll just go over this real quick for you.
Sure.
One is to identify your risk of any company, any merchant, whatever it may be. Identify where your vulnerabilities are and attach them to different methods that have been identified or otherwise, right?
Okay.
That's 1. 2 is to implement data management schemes in order to make sure that you know what you're looking at and you can track your progress, you can monitor your progress.
Okay.
The third one is, as a company grows and expands, maybe the volume of risk justifies the cost of a service provider and automating the process.
Okay.
So it's identify, monitor, automate, and then repeat, because every company is going to grow and new threats are going to arise.
Got it.
So that's my strategy. That's how I work with my merchant clients. And I think that's the basis of everything when it comes to risk. As you were saying, do it now, right? Do it now. Start, lay the foundation, start, and then adapt it later on. Yeah.
That's awesome. Yeah. I love that. And, if you have any other thoughts, let me know, but that's a strong place to wrap up on. I've been talking to people about this framework that I call the ABZ framework, right? You're at A, you want to get to Z. You don't have to know all the letters in between. The next step is B. So do B, and then you'll figure it out, and then you can do C. You don't have to know what is the 17-year plan for this risk management strategy. Well, you know what? We got to get something. So let's get it, and let's put it in place, and let's learn from it, because you know what? It's not going to take 2 days. It's probably going to take 2 months or 2 quarters or 2 years to really be adept at that. So get started on it, and you can make decisions along the way to invest in it more, to swap it out, to automate it, or whatever. Anything else you want to leave us with, Alexander? Or go ahead.
I am going to take that. I'm going to use that. ABZ.
Yeah.
I love that.
That's fine. You can say you made it up. Just use it, give it to people. Just, help people with it, because I think a lot of people get kind of hung up on like, all right, well, I need a, 45-point strategic plan to present for the next 8 quarters. And it's like, that's great if you can do that. The world's kind of moving a little too quickly for that. So what's step B? I know step B is we got to set something up. We got to start this. We got to start tracking the data or whatever it is. So do B, and then, let's talk in a month and see if we can figure out C.
I think that's awesome. I think you just closed this. That's great. That, if there's anything to be said, that's it. Because every project falls into that A, B, Z. I'm loving that, man.
It's everything. So, let's do B. I don't need you to sign a contract with me for, C through R. Let's do B and let's get started. And you know what? You'll be better in a month and we can see where it goes from there.
Great stuff.
All right, man. Well, listen, this has been great. I really appreciate you sharing your time with us. I appreciate you sharing your insight, but on what you're doing, what Dispute Defense Consulting is doing to help companies, especially financial institutions and merchants, understand where their risks are. And I'm just so glad that you came on and spent some time with us. It's been a great chat.
Yes, it has. Thank you so much for having me. This was awesome.
All right. Well, let's wrap up. This has been the show. Thank you for joining the Ethics Experts. I'm your host, Giovanni Gallo, and we will see you next time. Join in and be sure to hit that subscribe button and share the show with some of your friends so that they can be a better manager of risk and a better ethics expert. Thanks for coming.